Economic exploitation and labor systems. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas ushered in an era of economic exploitation and labor systems that profoundly impacted indigenous peoples and shaped the development of colonial societies across the region. European colonizers sought to exploit the natural resources of the Americas for their own profit, leading to the establishment of extractive industries such as mining, agriculture, and logging. Indigenous lands were forcibly seized and converted into plantations, mines, and ranches, where indigenous peoples were often coerced or forced into labor under brutal and exploitative conditions. One of the most notorious examples of economic exploitation in the Americas was the encomienda system, which was introduced by Spanish colonizers in the early colonial period. Under the encomienda system, indigenous communities were forced to work on Spanish-owned estates in exchange for protection and religious instruction. However, in practice, the encomienda system was little more than a form of slavery, as indigenous laborers were subjected to harsh working conditions, forced labor, and abuse at the hands of Spanish overseers. In addition to the encomienda system, European colonizers also established other forms of coerced labor, such as the Mita system in the Andean region and the repartimiento system in Mesoamerica. These systems required indigenous communities to provide a certain number of laborers to work in Spanish-owned mines, plantations, and public works projects. Indigenous laborers were often subjected to long hours, dangerous conditions, and meager wages, leading to widespread suffering and exploitation. The economic exploitation of indigenous peoples was not limited to coerced labor. It also extended to the extraction of natural resources such as gold, silver, furs, and timber. European colonizers sought to exploit the abundant natural wealth of the Americas for their own profit, leading to the rapid depletion of natural resources and the destruction of indigenous lands and ecosystems. Indigenous peoples were often displaced from their ancestral lands and denied access to traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering grounds as European colonizers sought to exploit the region's resources for their own enrichment. Moreover, the economic exploitation of indigenous peoples had profound social and cultural consequences, leading to the erosion of traditional economic systems, social structures, and cultural practices. Traditional subsistence economies based on hunting, fishing, agriculture, and trade were undermined as indigenous peoples were coerced or forced into wage labor on European-owned estates. Social hierarchies were disrupted as traditional leaders and knowledge holders were marginalized and disempowered by European colonizers. Cultural practices such as communal land ownership, reciprocal labor exchanges, and spiritual traditions were suppressed or banned by European authorities in an effort to assimilate indigenous peoples into European colonial societies. In conclusion, the economic exploitation of indigenous peoples in the Americas was a central feature of European colonization and shaped the development of colonial societies across the region. European colonizers sought to exploit the natural resources of the Americas for their own profit, leading to the establishment of extractive industries such as mining, agriculture, and logging that relied heavily on coerced indigenous labor. The legacy of economic exploitation continues to reverberate through the Americas today, as indigenous peoples grapple with the ongoing effects of centuries of dispossession, marginalization, and exploitation. Cultural encounters and syncretism. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas precipitated a series of cultural encounters and exchanges between indigenous peoples and European colonizers that reshaped the cultural landscape of the region and gave rise to new forms of cultural expression and identity. European colonization brought with it a host of new cultural practices, beliefs, and technologies that had a profound impact on indigenous societies. European languages, religions, and customs were imposed on indigenous peoples through a variety of means, including missionary efforts, coercive assimilation policies, and forced acculturation. Indigenous peoples were often forced to abandon their traditional languages, religions, and cultural practices in favor of European norms and values, leading to the erosion of indigenous identities and cultural autonomy. However, the encounter between indigenous peoples and European colonizers also gave rise to new forms of cultural expression and identity as indigenous communities adapted, resisted, and synthesized elements of European and indigenous cultures. This process of cultural syncretism, or the blending of cultural traditions from different cultural groups, led to the emergence of hybrid cultural forms that reflected the complex interplay between indigenous and European influences. One of the most notable examples of cultural syncretism in the Americas is the blending of indigenous and European religious practices and beliefs. European missionaries sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, often through coercive means, but indigenous peoples often adapted and incorporated elements of Christianity into their existing belief systems. This resulted in the emergence of new religious practices and rituals that blended indigenous and Christian elements, such as the veneration of Christian saints alongside indigenous deities and spirits. Similarly, the encounter between indigenous peoples and European colonizers gave rise to new forms of artistic expression and cultural production that reflected the diverse influences and traditions of both indigenous and European cultures. Indigenous artisans and craftsmen adapted European techniques and materials to create new forms of pottery, textiles, and metalwork that blended indigenous motifs and designs with European styles and aesthetics. Likewise, European colonizers adopted indigenous artistic techniques and motifs in their own artistic productions, leading to the emergence of hybrid artistic styles that reflected the cultural diversity of the Americas. Cultural syncretism also manifested in other aspects of indigenous life, including language, cuisine, music, and dance. Indigenous languages borrowed words and phrases from European languages, while European languages adopted indigenous place names, plant names, and other terms. Indigenous cuisines incorporated European ingredients and cooking techniques, while European cuisines adopted indigenous staples such as corn, potatoes, and beans. Indigenous music and dance forms influenced European musical traditions, while European musical instruments and styles found their way into indigenous musical performances. In conclusion, the encounter between indigenous peoples and European colonizers in the Americas gave rise to a complex process of cultural syncretism that reshaped the cultural landscape of the region. Despite the efforts of European colonizers to impose their own cultural norms and values on indigenous peoples, indigenous communities adapted, resisted, and synthesized elements of European and indigenous cultures to create new forms of cultural expression and identity. The legacy of cultural syncretism continues to shape the cultural diversity and richness of the Americas today, as indigenous and non-indigenous peoples alike draw on the diverse traditions and influences that have shaped the region over centuries of cultural encounters and exchanges.